Can a nation truly control its future if it does not know who is paying to educate its young people? That question is becoming increasingly important in Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traore says, authorities are identifying more than 1,000 young Burkinabe studying in several Arab countries. He said an earlier list contained more than 800 names. What concerned him was not simply that these young people had traveled abroad. According to Traore, authorities and diplomatic missions did not have a clear picture of how some of them left, who supported them, or exactly what they were studying. Traore said they were studying Sharia, Islamic law, and Islamic jurisprudence. He also argued that the list he examined did not show them learning practical trades. But an important distinction must be made immediately. Studying Islam or Sharia does not make someone an extremist. Millions of Muslims study their faith peacefully, just as Christians and followers of traditional religions study theirs. The real question is whether Burkina Faso has institutions strong enough to understand and oversee foreign-funded programs involving its young citizens without attacking religious freedom. That question carries unusual weight in a country already struggling against violent extremist organizations, while many families face disrupted education, insecurity, and limited economic opportunities. If young people cannot find enough opportunities at home, outside scholarships and financial support can become extremely attractive. That does not automatically make foreign assistance dangerous. But when funding, education, and ideological influence operate without transparency, a government has legitimate questions to ask. Traore is now asking those questions forcefully. Who finances these programs? What are students being taught? Why are Burkina Faso's own religious leaders not training more young people at home? And can the country provide better educational and professional alternatives itself? This story is therefore larger than religion. It is about education, security, money, responsibility, and ultimately sovereignty. If you believe Africa's future depends on strong institutions and informed citizens, follow this channel as we examine what is really changing in Burkina Faso. Because behind these students stands a much larger question. Who should shape the next generation of Africa? The first challenge is separating what has been confirmed from what Ibrahim Traore himself has claimed. Traore says, Burkina Faso is identifying more than 1,000 young citizens studying in Arab countries. He described an earlier list containing more than 800 people and said the diplomatic missions concerned did not have adequate knowledge of their activities. Those are serious claims, but they should not be exaggerated. There is not yet a publicly available independent list allowing outsiders to verify every student, every destination, every source of funding, or every course of study. Nor is there evidence demonstrating that these young people belong to terrorist organizations. That distinction matters because the strategic problem is larger than any accusation against individual students. Imagine a government discovering that hundreds of its young citizens have entered foreign educational networks that it understands poorly. Even if every student involved has peaceful intentions, the situation exposes a weakness. The state does not possess a complete picture of where its citizens are being educated, who finances that education, or what institutions will influence them before they return home. For Burkina Faso, this becomes a question of sovereignty. Borders are not the only places where sovereignty is exercised. Governments also build sovereignty through schools, professional training, public institutions, and their ability to understand financial networks operating inside society. Traore's strongest argument, therefore, does not depend on proving that these students are dangerous. It depends on demonstrating that the state has been operating with a blind spot. But closing that blind spot requires care. Registration is different from criminalization. Financial transparency is different from banning foreign scholarships. Monitoring genuine security threats is different from treating religious education as evidence of extremism. Burkina Faso must preserve those distinctions if it wants stronger institutions without creating another source of division. And this is where the story becomes more significant. Traore's comments did not appear in isolation. Before he publicly raised the issue of these students, his government had already begun changing the legal framework governing religion inside Burkina Faso. That suggests something broader is underway. The country is not merely asking what happened to several hundred young people. It is reconsidering how the state should manage religion, security, and national cohesion. To understand why Traore's warning matters, we have to look at what Burkina Faso had already begun doing before his remarks about students abroad. In March 2026, the government moved forward with legislation intended to redefine the legal framework surrounding religious freedom. Officials argued that existing rules contained gaps that had become increasingly difficult to ignore in a country facing insecurity, religious intolerance, radicalization, and violent extremism. Then, in June 2026, lawmakers unanimously approved a new law containing 112 articles. The principle behind it reveals the difficult balance Burkina Faso is attempting to achieve. The state says it wants to protect freedom of conscience, religious belief, and worship. At the same time, it wants stronger safeguards for public order, peaceful coexistence, and social cohesion. Those goals can support each other, but they can also come into conflict. A government facing extremist violence has legitimate reasons to investigate organizations that finance recruitment, promote violence, or operate outside the law. Yet, religious freedom loses its meaning if authorities can label peaceful disagreement as extremism simply because they find it uncomfortable. That is why the real test will not be the strength of the law on paper. It will be how that law is applied. Will Muslim, Christian, Protestant, and traditional religious communities receive equal treatment? Will religious leaders understand what conduct is prohibited? Will citizens have meaningful protections when they believe authorities have gone too far? And will security measures target dangerous behavior rather than religious identity? These questions become especially important when we return to Traore's concerns about students abroad. His remarks came after the government had already started strengthening its legal oversight of religious activity. Seen together, these developments suggest a broader effort to reduce areas where the state believes outside influence, unregulated organizations, or extremist ideas can operate without sufficient scrutiny. But stronger oversight alone cannot guarantee national unity. Burkina Faso must prove that it can protect the secular character of the state while allowing peaceful believers to practice their faith freely. That is the difficult line Traore's government is now walking. And behind that legal debate lies another source of power that may be even harder to regulate: money. Money is where this debate becomes more complicated. In Traore's argument, financial support is one reason some young Burkinabe accept religious education abroad. For a family with limited resources, an offer covering tuition, housing, food, and travel can be difficult to refuse. The young person may simply see an opportunity that does not exist at home. That is why foreign money should not automatically be treated as hostile influence. Burkina Faso itself continues to benefit from international educational partnerships. Japan and the United Nations Children's Fund, for example, have supported new schools and technical education programs in the country. Such cooperation demonstrates that outside financing can strengthen national capacity rather than weaken it. So the important question is not whether the money is foreign. The questions are whether the funding is transparent, who determines the educational program, what obligations students accept, and whether Burkina Faso knows what institutions are involved. Those distinctions matter. Foreign financing that builds classrooms, trains workers, transfers useful knowledge, and operates openly can expand a country's choices. Financing that moves through networks the state cannot identify or understand presents a different problem, particularly when it concerns the ideological or religious education of young citizens in a country already confronting extremist violence. But even here, suspicion must not become evidence. There is currently no basis for claiming that every foreign religious scholarship is designed to radicalize Burkinabe students. There is also no justification for treating Arab funding, Islamic education, or Sharia studies as inherently dangerous. A serious sovereignty policy must be more disciplined than that. Burkina Faso could require transparency about sponsors, institutions, programs, and scholarship recipients while continuing to allow legitimate international education. That would shift the debate away from fear and toward accountability. And it would establish an important principle for Africa. Sovereignty does not require rejecting knowledge or money because it comes from abroad. It requires having institutions strong enough to know what is entering the country, understand the conditions attached to it, and decide whether those conditions serve the public interest. But there is another uncomfortable question. If Burkina Faso wants its young people to depend less on opportunities financed elsewhere, what meaningful opportunities can it offer them at home? That question leads to the most human part of the story. Burkina Faso has endured years of violence and insecurity that have disrupted schools, displaced families, and narrowed opportunities for young people. At different points in the crisis, thousands of schools have been unable to operate, affecting hundreds of thousands of children. For an older generation, this should raise a familiar question. What happens to a young person when the institutions that are supposed to prepare him for adulthood can no longer provide a reliable path forward? If a young Burkinabe sees few opportunities at home and then receives an offer to study abroad with tuition, accommodation, and other expenses covered, accepting that opportunity may be a rational decision. That young person should not automatically be treated as the problem. The deeper problem is the shortage of alternatives. This is why Traore's criticism that the students he reviewed were not learning practical trades deserves attention beyond the religious debate. Burkina Faso needs young people who can become technicians, farmers, mechanics, entrepreneurs, teachers, health workers, engineers, and skilled tradespeople. There are already efforts moving in that direction. Programs supported inside Burkina Faso have provided young people with vocational training in areas including mechanics, solar energy, poultry farming, baking, textiles, and other practical skills. New investments have also supported general education and technical schools. These initiatives point toward a more durable answer. If the government wants young people to become less dependent on outside financial networks, it must make opportunities inside Burkina Faso more credible. That means improving education. It means expanding vocational training. It means creating paths from training into employment and small business. And it means recognizing that religious education and practical skills do not have to compete. A young Muslim can study his faith and learn a profession. The same principle can apply across religious communities. Control alone cannot solve the problem. A government can monitor scholarships and financial networks, but it cannot build national resilience simply by telling young people where they should not go. It must give them somewhere worth staying. And that brings us to Traore's proposed alternative. Instead of depending entirely on religious training abroad, why not build more of that capacity inside Burkina Faso itself? Traore's proposed alternative begins with a simple challenge to Burkina Faso's own religious leaders. If young Muslims need religious education, why should the country assume that serious training must take place abroad? Burkina Faso already has Islamic organizations capable of training imams and religious leaders. Recent programs inside the country have brought imams and preachers together to study peace, social cohesion, civic responsibility, and the role religious leaders can play during a national security crisis. That existing capacity matters. It suggests that Burkina Faso does not need to choose between suppressing religious education and surrendering it to foreign institutions. There is a third option. Strengthen credible religious education at home while making its financing transparent. Traore has also broadened the argument beyond Islam. In his remarks, he spoke about finding national resources for young Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and followers of traditional beliefs. That distinction is essential. If the government supports one community while treating another primarily as a security concern, the policy itself could deepen the divisions it claims to prevent. A stronger model would divide responsibility clearly. Religious communities should remain responsible for teaching their faith. Imams should teach Islam. Christian leaders should guide Christian communities. Traditional religious authorities should preserve their own traditions. The state should perform a different role. It should enforce the law, monitor suspicious financial networks, require reasonable transparency, and intervene when there is credible evidence of recruitment for violence or other illegal activity. Civil society should also have room to watch the government itself, because protecting the country from extremism cannot mean giving officials unlimited authority over belief. And religious training can be connected to a broader education. A student preparing for religious leadership could also learn agriculture, business, technology, teaching, or another practical profession. Faith and useful skills do not have to be enemies. That may be the most constructive interpretation of Traore's challenge. Burkina Faso can reduce dependence on opaque foreign networks, not by isolating its religious communities, but by giving those communities stronger institutions at home. If that succeeds, the country gains more than oversight. It gains capacity. And that idea of building national capacity is central to understanding Ibrahim Traore himself. To understand why this issue fits Ibrahim Traore's political message, we have to look beyond religion. Traore repeatedly presents sovereignty as the ability of Burkina Faso to develop its own capacity rather than permanently depending on decisions, institutions, or resources controlled elsewhere. Young people occupy an important place in that vision. In June 2026, while meeting ministers responsible for youth from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Traore described the young population of the Alliance of Sahel states as a strategic resource. His message was that this generation must be organized, educated, and prepared to contribute directly to the development of the region. Seen from that perspective, his concern about religious students abroad becomes easier to understand. For Traore, the issue is not simply where a young person prays. It is whether Burkina Faso has enough influence over the institutions shaping that person's future. This expands the meaning of sovereignty. There is territorial sovereignty, which concerns borders and national security. There is economic sovereignty, which concerns resources, production, and finance. There is institutional sovereignty, which concerns who makes important national decisions. And there is another form that receives less attention: human sovereignty. Who educates the next generation? Who gives young people their skills? Who finances their opportunities? And who shapes the institutions they will eventually lead? Traore's influence allows those questions to travel beyond Burkina Faso. His Pan-African message has attracted supporters who see him as a symbol of greater African independence. But admiration creates its own danger. A policy should not be considered successful merely because Ibrahim Traore supports it. If Burkina Faso's new approach depends entirely on one leader giving orders, then the country has not built strong sovereignty. It has built dependence of another kind. Durable sovereignty requires institutions that survive precedent and political transitions. It requires clear laws, transparent financing, accountable public agencies, protections for religious freedom, and meaningful limits on government power. That is the deeper test of Traore's leadership. He can initiate change and place difficult questions before the public. But his lasting influence will depend on whether Burkina Faso creates institutions capable of carrying those changes forward without depending on him personally. And that is precisely where Traore's critics begin their strongest argument. The strongest criticism of Traore begins with a legitimate question. Who watches the government when the government claims greater power to fight extremism? International media and human rights critics have raised concerns about restrictions on civil liberties, pressure on journalists, arrest of critics, and allegations of abuses by security forces in Burkina Faso. More recently, tensions between the authorities and some Muslim religious figures have added another concern. Measures designed to fight radicalization could eventually reach peaceful religious expression. That possibility should not be dismissed simply because the criticism comes from outside Africa. religious freedom means little if the government alone can decide which peaceful beliefs are acceptable. But their criticism also deserves a response. Burkina Faso is confronting violent extremist organizations and has a legitimate responsibility to investigate recruitment networks, suspicious financing, and organizations promoting violence. No country should be expected to ignore financial or ideological networks simply because they cross its borders under the label of education or religion. The difficult question is where that authority ends. The same balance applies to Western criticism more broadly. Relations between Burkina Faso and France have deteriorated dramatically, culminating in Burkina Faso severing diplomatic relations with France in June 2026. Yet, there is no credible evidence connecting France to the specific religious education network Traore described. Those issues should not be combined without proof. Nor should every Western criticism be dismissed as an attempt to restore foreign control. Western governments and organizations can legitimately question Traore's record on civil liberties. At the same time, Burkina Faso can legitimately question foreign influence operating without sufficient transparency. Both principles can be true. The West can ask who limits Traore's power. Traore can ask who monitors outside influence. And ordinary Africans have the right to ask both sides a harder question. Which system actually gives their children greater security, freedom, education, opportunity, and control over their own future? Burkina Faso's experience offers lessons that extend beyond its borders. The first is transparency. African governments do not need to reject every scholarship, investment, or educational partnership that comes from abroad. They need systems capable of identifying who provides the money, who receives it, what is being taught, and what obligations accompany that support. The second lesson is equally important. Islam must not become a scapegoat for failures of security or governance. A Muslim studying Sharia is not automatically an extremist, just as religious devotion does not prove support for violence. Governments should investigate illegal behavior, recruitment, and suspicious financial networks rather than treating faith itself as evidence of guilt. Third, sovereignty requires alternatives. If African leaders want young people to rely less on foreign-funded opportunities, they must expand education, vocational training, employment, and entrepreneurship at home. A prohibition cannot compete with a scholarship unless the country offers a credible path of its own. Fourth, religious communities should become partners in prevention. Muslim, Christian, and traditional leaders can help defend social cohesion while governments enforce transparent laws that apply equally to everyone. The fifth lesson concerns the alliance of Sahel states. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are increasingly presenting youth, development, and sovereignty as interconnected challenges. But the long-term test for Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, Abdourahmane Chiani, and future leaders will be whether they build institutions stronger than their individual personalities. Finally, sovereignty must not become isolation. African countries should be able to cooperate with the United States, France, China, Russia, Arab nations, or any other partner when cooperation serves their interests. Real independence is not refusing everyone. It is having the institutional strength to say yes without surrendering control and to say no without fear. That may be the broader lesson for West Africa and the Sahel. A sovereign Africa needs open doors, but Africa itself must hold the keys. So we return to the question that started this story. Who should shape the next generation of Burkina Faso? The young people Ibrahim Traore says his government is identifying are more than a statistic. Their situation exposes a challenge facing many African countries. When opportunities are limited at home, outside money, scholarships, institutions, and ideas can become powerful forces in shaping the future. The answer cannot be fear. It cannot be hostility toward Islam, Christianity, traditional faiths, or foreign cultures. And it cannot be the assumption that every outside partner arrives with bad intentions. The stronger answer is capacity. Burkina Faso needs transparent rules for foreign funding. It needs better schools and vocational training. It needs religious leaders who can educate their communities while defending peaceful coexistence. It needs institutions capable of identifying genuine extremist recruitment without treating peaceful religious belief as a crime. Above all, those institutions must remain accountable. Ibrahim Traore has raised a difficult question about sovereignty, but history will not judge his leadership only by the force of his speeches. It will judge whether Burkina Faso builds institutions that remain effective after today's leaders are gone. The same challenge faces Assimi Goïta in Mali and Abdourahmane Chiani in Niger. Across West Africa and the wider Sahel, young populations need more than political slogans. They need education, skills, security, employment, and a reason to believe their future can be built at home. That should also matter to the African Union and to anyone following African news. The question of foreign influence cannot be answered simply by choosing between France and Russia, between Western partners and new partners, or between isolation and dependence. Africa needs another option. Cooperation without surrender, openness without blindness, faith without extremism, security without persecution, and sovereignty supported by institutions rather than personalities. That is the larger lesson emerging from Burkina Faso. A country does not become sovereign merely by closing its doors to outsiders. It becomes sovereign when it can open those doors, understand who is entering, decide what serves its people, reject what threatens them, and still protect the rights of its own citizens. So, where should that boundary be drawn? How far should a government go in monitoring foreign religious funding while protecting freedom of belief? Share your view, because this debate will not end in Burkina Faso. It could shape how African nations think about education, religion, security, and independence for years to come. And if you want to follow these deeper questions about Africa's changing future, stay with this channel. Because Africa's strongest defense against outside influence may ultimately be something no foreign power can provide. Strong institutions and confident citizens who can choose their own future. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.